Hey, what's going on, guys? In this video, I'm going to talk about should you specialize or should you be a generalist? There is advice that goes in both directions. I think there are reasons, good reasons, reasonable reasons why you might choose either path. And I'm going to give you my advice, which is, as always, a little bit of both. So first I want to go through the advantages of like choosing one of these paths and focusing on it. And depending on your personality and your interests, one of these paths may be mostly the right way to go. But I think there's some value to kind of doing both. And I'll talk about kind of how to approach that a little bit later. So first, the advantages of being a generalist are fairly obvious. You can work very independently. You can essentially be given a problem and trusted to more or less figure it out. One of the things that becoming a generalist gives you is the ability to learn efficiently, to learn enough to get stuff done in a wide variety of disciplines. So if you're a Linux guy, you'll probably also know some networking, something about databases, something about how the web works and security and DNS. I already said networking, but DNS is its own beast. A little bit about mail. Sort of a lot of these different topics will be stuff that you run into under a generalist, Linux, sysadmin, or sysops, or DevOps kind of like title. The advantages are job security. You do a lot of stuff and you bring a lot of different value to a company. So it's like easy to justify, like I do 17 different things and I'm capable of learning more at any time. That's very attractive, from like a management standpoint. Like this guy really knows his stuff. Like it's someone we can keep around who can be flexible if our needs change. So there's job security and there's also like a large job market for that type of person. Being a specialist, on the other hand, looks a little bit different, but it opens up other opportunities. You'll generally have a higher wage just because you are more specialized. Different types of job opportunities will be open to you. Stuff like consulting gigs are much easier to get because there's like a specific problem. It's in the database. We need a database guy and we will pay 10 grand a week to get one. And if you work for a consulting company, you might get 5 grand a week for it. But it's still enough of a bump over what you might make as a just sort of a generalist, like at the place that's hiring you as a consultant, that it's very attractive to a lot of people. And it really represents like a one-time large investment in a technology, and then you just got to kind of stay up to date. Now, I'm not saying it's like easier to be a specialist. It's just you have a lot more upfront investment in a specific skill. That skill could go out of date, or like the fad could change. Our industry, unfortunately, is very fad-driven and has no concept of history and certainly no memory for it, recognizing patterns that we've seen before. But again, I mean, you have fewer job openings, but those tend to be higher paid. It's often easier to go independent as a consultant just based on the network you've built up and the places you've been. And it can be easy to kind of develop a feeling of accomplishment. You get respect because you go to a place, and even if you've only been doing whatever you've been doing for 2 years, you walk in and there's like a sysops guy who's been doing 10 years as a generalist, but you know more about Postgres or whatever it is than he does or she does. Well, then you sort of have like in that situation higher status than someone who's worked way harder and probably way longer than you. So my advice is a little bit different. Instead of picking one of these ways, although you'll find yourself naturally gravitating towards one of these things, just based on your personality and your interests and your experience so far in this industry, I think there's a lot of value in taking a little bit of both. So establishing a kind of generalist foundation of knowledge that lets you fit new information in very quickly, kind of because it gives you a large kind of tree of knowledge to hang new knowledge on. So it can make future learning much easier. You'll come across a ton of concepts that are useful later on, regardless of what you pick up, if you are approaching everything as a generalist to begin with, and just kind of learning a little bit more shallow, but a much broader range of subjects. Once you have a foundation in whatever it is you've picked. Now, that could be like Linux and system operations kind of stuff. It could be whatever it is, like electrical engineering. It could be programming and software development. Once you've picked up that generalist knowledge, like you know how to do a whole bunch of different things that are useful pretty much everywhere, I think then at that point you will have some idea already of what's really interesting to you. A lot of the time you can't know what's going to really like strike your fancy. I talk about this a little bit in the, I think it's a video titled like Finding Your Programming Passion, and where the idea is basically a very accelerated version of becoming a generalist, of like you take a project, you work through every part of the stack, from like putting a computer together from components to writing some software on that computer, to dealing with like backups, storage, networking, getting it online, setting it up as a server, some sysops like installing packages, dealing with system needs. And that gives you a very quick introduction to a whole broad range of things. I don't think you can, as a beginner, say, oh, I'm really going to love storage, let me invest 2 years in learning it, or I love databases so much that I'm going to jump right into them without knowing anything else. And I actually think that on the job, if you are a specialist, I've run into database people that have no idea of Linux. Like they are a genius in a MySQL shell, and then as soon as they're in like Bash as a shell, they are helpless. They don't even know the most basic commands. I mean, that's, I think, thankfully getting a little bit more rare, but it's still a thing. Even as a specialist, I would discourage you from being totally specialized. Going back to what I was saying about once you have built that generalist foundation, whether you do it at a high speed, like I recommend in that video, or slower, just through the course of your career, your first few jobs, and your kind of extracurricular study, as you build that foundation, you will have gravitated towards some things. Like I always tell the story of my friend who, without knowing much even about Linux or Unix, he started learning that stuff and then kind of bumped into ZFS, the file system. And he was so amazed at its power and its features that he was like, I've never seen anything this awesome before. I'm going to stay here and learn a little bit about it. And in the span of a few months, he actually learned more about ZFS than I had picked up in actually using it over the course of a year. That kind of like natural progression is what I'm talking about. That's where you're actually going to learn the most. And it'll be a way of specializing that doesn't leave you with regrets. Like, well, I got into databases because I heard you can make like 80K starting, and I just wanted a higher starting salary, but I actually hate what I do because Oracle is a hot mess, and this is no way to lead a life. It'll prevent that kind of thing if you allow your natural interests to draw you into specialization. So that's what I recommend. Generalist foundation, and then let that guide you into a couple of fields that you really are passionate about, and then you can specialize in one, and you can maybe add one later. So just some examples of this, things like infrastructure design or architecture, things like monitoring, things like security, networking, automation, specifically like infrastructure automation, things like storage, databases, a specific database. All of these are very interesting specializations, and they can also be domain specific. What I recommend, I'll talk about that in a second. What I recommend is you take sort of your base skill set, whether that's like system administration or ops, some kind of like ops skill, or something like software development, programming, computer science, or whatever other base skill you're working with, like the thing, your first tech passion, and you mix it with one of those. Like, so you might be working on a project that involves that, and you say, oh, wow, monitoring's pretty cool. Like, I would like to see, how to set up like a modern, clever, well-done monitoring and alerting system that prevents like alert fatigue, that monitors things that we really care about, that monitors things in a way where we are able to prevent problems from happening, and it just doesn't just scream once everything's already gone wrong. If that's your interest, that's fantastic. If you're a software engineer, you would like start writing some software that might be doing that, just to learn a little bit more about how it works. If you're an ops guy, you might learn about all the most interesting and advanced tools that do that right now and how they're different from what's been used for the last 15 years or 10 years, trying to kind of figure out where that's going. Now, I mentioned that you can kind of treat domain-specific knowledge also as a specialization. And what I mean by that is, sure, you have all these IT topics like, distributed systems, networking, security, storage, all the stuff I just mentioned, that you can kind of stack on top of software development, or you can stack on top of ops to give you that sort of specialized superpower, the one thing you're really great at, or the first thing you're really great at. But I think domain knowledge, and I might need to do this in another video, but domain knowledge is another one of those things that you can kind of supercharge your skill set with. I'll give you an example. If you are, I think this works best with software development and like programming, but you can do it with other disciplines too. So I'll talk about software development. So if you know how to program, that's great. You might know how to make some web apps, some command line apps, and you're like an okay, just sort of like basic level programmer. You've been programming for a year or two, and you can make stuff. Like you understand the rules basically, and you can write reasonably maintainable, well-documented working code. One thing you can do to go from like junior dev making like 70 or 75 to someone who is indispensable to a business who's making like 120 or more is having specific domain knowledge that's useful to that company. So for example, if you're working for a weather company, if you're an amateur meteorologist, that's something that you're interested in, whether you know a ton about it, that will allow you to be a much better software developer for that domain-specific software. So you find a company that's working in that space that you care about and know about. And because software a lot of the time is just a modeling of the real world and then figuring things out very quickly, having a software developer that's already like up on that domain is extremely useful. At a startup, it can be indispensable, so you can make yourself very important in a good way. Like you can drive a ton of value into a company by simply really understanding the domain that they're in. So if you're like a real estate agent and you join a software company that wants to start some kind of real estate app, well, you're incredibly valuable because you can model the real world space. You understand like some of the legal stuff, some of the skills you need, like some of the attributes that properties have, and like some of the complications and what people want. You're incredibly valuable because you know that stuff and you can translate it into code. Think about your hobbies. They don't have to be technical like the first kind of extras I mentioned. There are things in there that if you learn them well, there are companies dealing with that, which probably means there's code being written to model that in some way. Okay, so that's it for this one. It's just a quick review. Generalist, excellent. I recommend doing that first, and then specialize based on what your passions are, what things you're naturally drawn to, or what seems so cool and fascinating to you that you need to know more about it. I think specializing too early is a mistake, can be a mistake. And I think being a generalist forever with no specific domain knowledge can be kind of painful because you'll feel like you're just some guy like fitting together spare parts that other people have invented. So that specialization kind of makes you feel like you're really doing something new, and it allows you to work kind of closer to the edge of actual innovation that's happening. So I hope that's useful. And remember, if you like this stuff, remember to thumbs up, subscribe. You can support me on Patreon. You can support me by buying t-shirts and other delicious merchandise now. You can support me by signing up for the mailing list on the website. Remember to leave your comments, questions, experiences backing up everything I just said below. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys.